Well, hello everybody out there in cyberspace. Thank you for joining us once again for one of the fine presenter speakers we have in our 19th annual John White Speaker Series. The museum's been here for 21, 22 years, and the John White Speaker Series has been here for 19 of those. So it shows you how important things like this and programs like this bringing history to the public, how much of a crucial part of our mission statement that is and how far we go to fulfill it. Not the least bit, putting it online for this 2021 winter season, just so that we can try to reach as many people as possible and hopefully keep everybody safe and secure and happy in their own homes. You hopefully have already seen our first two John White speakers, Dr. Bridget Cavane from Montana State University in Bozeman about Latino history in Montana. And then, of course, my friend John Fraley, who talked about the heroes of the Bob Marshall Wilderness. If you haven't seen either one of those, go to our website. They'll be available throughout the winter. And check out either one of those presentations in our John White Speaker Series. And today, I am overjoyed, super happy to have another great presenter, somebody I'm very much looking forward to talking to about this. Bob Brown, who is familiar, and I feel like I don't have to introduce him very much at all, probably familiar to a lot of you out there watching. Bob was involved in Montana state politics for 30 years, first as a legislature, then as the Secretary of State, former president of the Montana Historical Society in Helena, longtime educator here in the Flathead Valley, and currently a member of our board here at the Northwest Montana Historical Society. So thank you very much for joining us today, Bob.
Well, thank you, Jacob, and it's my great pleasure to be able to do this. It makes me feel old.
Well,
because
it should make you feel. It should make you feel accomplished. Not accomplished.
I think that's for others to decide, but I was just going to make the comment.
Yes.
That I remember Johnny White.
Yeah, oh yeah.
They called him Johnny White, and he was the custodian that was then the junior high, and he was an African American and revered, very well thought of, and he was retiring about the time that I crossed paths with him. I was actually brought up on a grain and cattle ranch way out in northwestern Flathead County in an area called the Bissell community. In fact, It may still be referred to as the Bissell community. The Bissell School, of course, is there. And I had an idyllic boyhood. I did a lot of my work on the tractor or on horseback, literally. We had a great swing in the old hay shed, the barn, and could do all kinds of acrobatic things on that. And I knew the best places to fish. In fact, I could go and come home with 10 cutthroat any day I wanted to, and people would wonder, where in the heck does that Brown kid catch those fish? And I never told anybody. There aren't any fish in that place now, but I had it pretty much to myself for a long time. And, learned to be a pretty good marksman. And
Bob, I bet there are still cutthroat where in that fishing spot. I bet you just don't want to give it away, right?
Well, I can, but I don't.
No.
It got discovered. It's called the Hanson Lake or Blast Lake. It's known by those two names. It was not a real long walk from where I lived. I was able to walk over there and back with my fishing pole when I was 13 years old and just catch fish to beat the band. They weren't real big. They were probably 10, 11, 12-inch cutthroat. But anyway, that was a wonderful time in my life.
Yeah.
And I also read a lot because my dad felt it was important for young people to read. And so he thought the best idea was to not have a television set, which would pretty much force my sister and I to listen to the radio. All that seemed boring to us, but we both became avid readers. And I'm extremely grateful for that. I discovered Theodore Roosevelt through my father's requirement to read. And today I think I have, 80 some books, I don't think quite 90, about or by Theodore Roosevelt, and I've read most of them.
Oh, yeah.
And then I enjoyed the drum and bugle history. My dad was a World War II veteran, so I was kind of interested in that sort of thing. And I have approximately that same number of books now on the Civil War. And I had ancestors on both sides of my family who fought in the Northern Army during the Civil War. So I've got a particular interest in that. But I became fascinated with politics because of those interests and because of my reading. We always took a newspaper and took a news magazine, and we had discussions in the evening out on the ranch and cold winter nights and things.
You know, I had that conversation. I had that question, Bob, and I'm sure that a lot of people out there watching also had that question. You know, how does such a intelligent and well-mannered person end up in politics? Were you blackmailed? Did they have something on you?
No, I just developed an interest in it. I can remember listening to Fulton Lewis Jr. and Ed P. Morgan on the radio, and there was kind of the Republican side and the Democrat side. But a lot of it was just my reading. And then I encountered this wonderful man who had great influence on me because my dad considered himself a Republican. I did too. And so I made the acquaintance of the Republican county chairman at the time, who was a man named Matt Himsel. And some of the people watching and listening to this would remember Matt Himsel. He was a deeply wise man and very patient. He had been a school teacher and a principal before he went into the car dealership business. But he took a lot of time with me. He enjoyed that there was a young person that was interested in what he was interested in. He was one of the few people in the county then, or anywhere around here then, who had a master's degree in political science. Pretty unusual then.
Oh, yeah.
And he really, really helped to kind of focus my thoughts. Well, when I got away to Montana State University, when I went away to college, I was kind of hungry for never being able to participate in activities when I was a kid in high school because of the long school bus route. It took us well over an hour to get from where I lived in the remote part of the Bissell community into Flathead High School, and the same amount of time to go home. So I left when it was dark in the morning and got home when it was dark at night for at least part of the year. I learned how to play chess on one of those little pegboard chess sets on the school bus. We had to have that, of course, because the road was so bumpy. And But anyway, when I got to college at MSU, I just threw myself into all the activities I'd never been able to be in before. And I became involved in debate. I got to be a member of the debate team. And in the 4 years that we debated there, we won the Montana State University debate team, won a lot of trophies. My partner and I won a lot of trophies. And we won, I think, 4 tournaments. We beat the Air Force Academy, we beat Stanford, we beat Dartmouth in a big national tournament. And so that was a very exciting thing in my life, and it gave me a way to get involved in things, you know, in a kind of a competitive and big time way that I'd never had before. Nobody wanted me on their basketball team or football team, but they'd take me on the debate team. And I was elected student body president in 1969, 70. And you know, what was going on then was the Vietnam War. So it was a pretty chaotic time on college campuses all over the country, including the Cow College in Bozeman a little bit. And I won't go into the details of the story, but I ended up as student body president going back to Washington, D.C. When at the height of the Vietnam War, really, right after the Kent State disaster, where those kids on Kent State campus in Ohio were killed by the National Guardsmen, I think, or something. And so we did a survey of the students and all the units of the university system in Montana. Those of us at MSU did. We had the guidance department help us with the test survey. And we learned what the kids in Montana thought on all the campuses. And then the president of MSU at that time, Dr. Leon Johnson, sent 3 of us back to Washington, D.C., the incoming student body president since I was outgoing, and another real bright young fellow who was the president of the Student Presidents Association, if any of that makes any difference to anybody. But what an exciting time, and what an exciting adventure that was for a farm kid from the Bissell community. Washington, D.C. is laid out, it's got these circles, and then the main streets go out like spokes on a wheel. And so when the protesters, college kids from all over the eastern seaboard, the colleges had just shut down, and those kids, thousands and thousands of them, tens of thousands of them, had flooded into Washington, D.C. to protest the Vietnam War, especially after the Kent State incident and the Cambodian invasion. So when we stayed at a hotel downtown and we got in a taxi cab, I think this happened to us at least 2 different days, we'd head up toward the Capitol building and we'd come to one of the circles. Runs in my mind it was DuPont Circle, but that's not important. Anyway, the kids had plugged up the streets, whatever the streets are that go through DuPont Circle, Massachusetts Avenue, Pennsylvania Avenue, Connecticut Avenue, whatever they were. And so the policeman would have to come in and drag these kids out of the circle, and the taxi cab would make a couple of yards, and they'd drag a few more out, and the other taxi cabs and other cars were trying to maneuver their ways through the circles, and as soon as the kids were dragged out, they'd go back and lay down in the circle again.
Yeah.
And so it was really tough to make any progress, and I saw no violence or anything like that. It was a completely peaceful protest, but it had pretty much succeeded in paralyzing Washington, D.C. And when we got up to the Capitol building, the corridors were just crammed again with kids, their backpacks, sitting down, laying down, standing up, that sort of thing. And it was virtually impossible, or had been, for Congress to function because the members of Congress couldn't get from their offices to their committee rooms or anything like that. Finally, a deal was brokered between Senator Mark Hatfield of Oregon and some students that seemed to be kind of surfacing as leaders. And the idea was, if the students wouldn't try to obstruct the progress of any member of Congress in the morning from 7 or 8 o'clock until noon, then the kids could go into all the offices, speak their piece to the members of the Senate and the House of Representatives in their offices all afternoon. And that compromise seemed to work out.
Yeah.
And that was just taking place when I got there. And so when I was back there, I was just excited about, everything that was going on. We weren't part of any of the protests, but we wanted to talk to our congressional delegation primarily. And Senator Mike Mansfield was the main member of our congressional delegation, but there were others. Mansfield took us on the floor of the U.S. Senate and introduced us to several senators who were there. Another exciting thing, we visited with him for a while in the Democratic cloakroom since he was a Democrat. Checked in with Senator Metcalf, our congressional delegation. Arnold Olson was from the Western District, and I believe Batten was from the Eastern District. All of them long dead now, but it was exciting for me to be able to meet him. And every day that I was back there, I called this newsman who was a reporter for the Lee newspapers by the name of Jerry Holleran. Somehow or other, I think I knew Holleran a little bit. He asked me to report back to him if I had any news to report. So I did. And when I got home, people were slapping me on the back and saying, "Wow, Bob, that was really neat. We've been reading about you in the paper." Well, what do you suppose? Matt Himsel, my wise old friend, who by then was a state representative in the State House of Representatives from Flathead County, contacted me and he said, "Bob, you should run for the legislature. I think you could get elected and I think you'd enjoy the heck out of it." So it was like holding a shot of whiskey in front of an alcoholic. I wanted to do that.
Yeah.
So I did. And again, all kinds of stories connected with that very first political campaign. But the bottom line is that I was successful. I won. Then the Flathead County elected 5 people to the House of Representatives. So the Democrats nominated 5 and the Republicans nominated 5. So it was really a 10-candidate free-for-all. And the top 5 won. And I placed 5th in the 10-person race.
That close, huh?
It was that close, but it was better than being 6th. And so I went to Helena, and again, my adventures continued. It was something that just seemed to kind of fit naturally with my interest. And
so, but Bob, it seemed like, I mean, from that story, it seemed that your passion didn't necessarily start, but was definitely, fanned a little bit by that deal you saw brokered when you were there in DC. Just the spirit of compromise and like the win-win situation that, politics, politics being what it is, there is a way for everybody to have their voice heard.
And I think that's been true in our country. In fact, I believe it still is. But the guy who brokered the deal, remember I told you, was Senator Mark Hatfield.
Right.
And I was an admirer of his. He was a somewhat anti-war Republican. And then the Republicans were more in favor of the Vietnam War than the Democrats were.
Yeah.
But I had wonderful opportunities. I had met him actually when I was a college student, and he came and gave a lecture at Montana State University, and I had a good opportunity to meet him. And then when we went back to Washington, D.C., the time I'm talking to you about, I managed to get into his office. And, he just passed away a couple of years ago, but he was a wonderfully principled, wonderfully decent, wonderfully effective member of the U.S. Senate. And his desk, the desk that he used on a daily basis in his office, was the desk that Abraham Lincoln had used when he was a lawyer in Illinois in his office.
Holy smokes.
And of course, to someone who loves history and had read a lot about the Civil War, that was just magical to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, so you're right. I think that, I was fascinated by politics increasingly from the time I was a kid, out in the country. But the trip to Washington, D.C. and the experience I had back there was kind of the big thing. And then, of course, Matt Himsel was always kind of in the background, mentoring me and helping me. When I got to the legislature, that was an enormously important thing to me. And there was a lot going on at that period of time in Montana. The 1972 Constitution was during that same period of time. I was elected in 70. My first legislative session was in 71. And then right after that, the Constitution delegates met and wrote the 1972 Constitution.
I think in our collection we have audio tapes from the meetings going over that writing that that constitutional convention.
Yeah. I've seen those, or at least some of those, and they are fascinating. And I'd encourage anybody who's interested in in government, not so much politics, but in government, to read or listen to that 1972 Constitution. And of course, that was it was a big time in the political history of Montana. Flathead County ratified the Constitution, and it only carried, I think, by a fraction of a percentage statewide. There's much opposition.
Why is that then?
It was pretty progressive. It declared that protection of the environment was a constitutional right. So basically the idea was anybody who is a citizen of Montana or a resident of Montana is entitled to clean air and clean water.
Right.
It's a constitutional right. And that was a kind of an unusual thing. It required that all the meetings in the legislature be open. And this is a basis for another lecture that could go a long ways. But at that time in Montana history, the Anaconda Company pretty much controlled the legislature and all the politics of the state.
Yeah.
And they had a corporate twin by the name of the Montana Power Company who joined with them in this. And so it was common then for the big companies, the terrible twins as the liberals referred to them, would close down the committee hearing rooms. And so that there weren't any members of the public that were present, including the press corps. They kicked the press out of the committee room, and then the members themselves would just go ahead and essentially do the company's bidding. And sometimes company lobbyists were sitting there in the room to kind of act like they were babysitters for the legislature.
Right. So they were closed committee meetings up to a point. It was who they allowed into the
exactly. Exactly. The committee chairman was almost always a company man.
Oh,
and
gotcha.
that was true whether they were Democrats or Republicans. People would be surprised at that, but there were many Democrats who were close to the companies. Some Republicans, myself included, who were pretty independent of the companies.
Yeah.
Joe Dixon was a political hero of mine. He was governor of Montana back in the 1920s, and he was a close protege of Theodore Roosevelt. And that old progressive strain of Republicans, and I considered myself part of that, were pretty independent of the big corporations. So I started out as a kind of a maverick in politics, and I still am, I guess. But Anyway, there were some big issues there were issues that related to the implementation of the Constitution.
Yeah.
And so some of those were pretty controversial. Great stories about before the open meeting law was passed that provided to legislative or applied to legislative committees as well as constitutional county commissioners and city councils. They couldn't hold their meetings in private anymore. And some of that's controversial to this day, I think.
Right.
But anyway, I don't know who of our watchers and listeners would remember the Cabin Creek coal development, but there was some coal, a big deposit of coal up in Canada at a place called Cabin Creek. Cabin Creek and Sage Creek were two streams up there, and there was a little mountain essentially of coal between them. And so the Canadian mining companies, the one I remember was Rio Tinto Zinc, but there was also one called Rio Algam, and one of them owned the other. One of them was essentially an international company. And they wanted to develop this coal. It was real good coal, and it was nearer the Pacific coast than much of the rest of the coal in the country was, so they could ship it to Japan inexpensively. And we'd think, well, what would we care as long as this development's up in Canada? Well, the problem was Sage Creek and Coal Creek flowed right into the North Fork of the Flathead River. And the Canadians had weak, almost non-existent sedimentation laws. And so what we were mortally afraid of in Montana was that Flathead Lake would become a big settling pond for this big coal development up in Canada.
And then we're still facing some of that today with Kukunusa. I mean,
exactly.
These issues, they come up, which is, for any, I could rant anti-political for now, but I'm not going to, Bob. But this is something that we can, as a historian, we can look at what we have accomplished before and how we have done so, and try to use those lessons to work with our problems in the present. And the realm of local government is a big part of that.
That's right. And I take some pride in the fact that I was involved in that controversy extensively at that time. And the problem, of course, we had was that the development was taking place in Canada, and we couldn't legislate laws in Montana or in the United States to have them clean up their act when they were strip mining coal. But what happened was, while that was going on, there was an old gentleman by the name of Jim Cumming from over in Columbia Falls, who was a lawyer. I'd never met him. He was probably older then than I am now, and that's OLD. But he said, here's an idea. He said there's a concept in the law called the long arm jurisdiction concept. And what that means is that we'd have to clarify this in Montana statutes, but he said, I've done a little research and I found out that Rio Algam, I think that was the one, the specific Canadian company. Rio means river in Spanish, I think, and I'm not sure. Tinto, I think, is Red River. That doesn't make you feel very good. Huh. The other was Algam. But anyway, the one that was specifically mining coal in Canada also owned U.S. borax in the United States. So Jim Cumming told me what we could do is make it clear in the Montana law that we could collect for damages that we had against the Rio company up in Canada from their subsidiary, U.S. Borax.
Right.
Borax. We could get them. We couldn't get the Canadian company. And so I introduced a bill to make that possible. We clarified that it was definitely possible in the Montana law. And that passed. And I've talked to the folks who are concerned about this selenium coming into the Lake Koocanusa now.
Right.
And apparently they're not sure that we could make the case based on the ownership of the mining company that's creating the problem up on the Elk River in Canada. But they know about that now. And so it could be that there's some longer arm jurisdiction way of getting at these polluters of Lake Koocanusa and Kootenai River and Lake Koocanusa, just like we went after them clear back in whenever that was, 73 or 74, I think.
Huh.
But that was a big local issue, and I was excited about being involved in that. And there was the 18 and 19-year-old drinking age and voting age that was going on then. And I had some influence in the legislature because I was the young guy. I was the youngest member of the legislature.
Yeah.
In either body. And so they kind of paid attention to me on stuff like that. So that was
How old were you, Bob, when you started out in the early 70s there?
22.
22.
22. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was 22 when elected, and I was 23 when I entered the legislature.
I don't think I would have been ready for that. I'm 32. I'm still not ready for that. I definitely would not. I definitely would not have been ready for that at 22.
Well, you're doing a good job, and we're lucky to have you. I'll tell you that.
Thank you.
The 1972 Constitution, which went into effect in 1972, was approved by a big vote in Flathead County, even though it was a close vote in the rest of the state. I think I already mentioned that. And
Yeah.
so, and it was a pretty progressive document, but we're talking about an era when Flathead Valley was a little different place than it is now. And I mentioned this to you, but I'll mention it now to our viewers and listeners. I did some research before giving this presentation today, and I think people will be interested to know that from 1948, I was born in 1947, so this is basically history of my life, the time that my life has spanned. From 1948 to 1984, I think I've got this right, yeah. From 1948 to 1984, Flathead County voted for, in majority, voted for 8 Democrat candidates for governor and 2 Republicans.
Oh, wow.
In that 10-year spread, with 10 elections from 48 to 84, Flathead County voted for 8 Democrats for governor and 2 Republicans for governor. Now, what do you suppose it is from 1988? Yeah, so the next election after 84 will be 1988. So from 88 to 2020, that's 9 elections. It's not quite 10 again. But in that period of time, we've elected 8 Republicans for governor and 1 Democrat. So right in the middle of the 1980s, things really began to switch in Flathead County. And people may say, well, Flathead County was competitive before 1984. But actually, Flathead County was lean Democrat before 1984.
So Bob, and I told you I was going to ask this little, try to bust you with this question, but so what changed then in the mid 80s? Was it the political parties and the makeup and what they stood for, or was it the Flathead county itself? Because until 2020, and obviously I've only been here permanently on a 4-year basis, but I believe the whole state of Montana, the run of Democrat governors goes back, a couple decades almost.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think the single biggest issue that was occurring in the middle 1980s was the decline of the timber industry.
Right.
Because many of those timber industry jobs were unionized. And we had several sawmills in the Flathead Valley, and they were unionized.
Right.
And the railroad brotherhoods were, when the railroad had a lot of employees, I mean, probably 5 times as many employees around here then as now, they were all unionized. And the aluminum plant, which became sick economically during that period of time, but it continued on for a while. But I think at one time it had something like 1,800 employees, and at the time that it closed, it had about 500, something like that.
That's a good commercial for our new our CFAC exhibit here at the museum. So if you are if you are heading to the Flathead Valley, or if you're here right now, stop on in the museum Monday through Friday and check out the exhibit.
Well, I'd like to see it here. Right by my desk, I've got an aluminum ingot.
That's right. And you gave us some good ones as well.
Yeah, I think I had 2 of them. I worked there for a while.
Yeah.
And so, but anyway, where were we here? Oh yeah, well, I was telling you what the reason I think for the economic decline. When you had these unionized jobs begin to disappear,
right,
that really crippled the Democratic Party in the Flathead Valley. And I think that's the single most important thing that happened. There was a lot of conflict and a lot of resentment between the wood butchers and the tree huggers, as the 2 sides, called each other. And but I think what happened was that a lot of the timber clear cutting was ceased, but with that came a lot of job loss, and then mechanization. Just one man could operate a timber machine that could do the job of several people before. Those things just combined. It wasn't entirely the environmentalists putting the timber industry out of business, but they had a significant impact. But it was also mechanization, world trade, the market for timber products and so on. Anyway, that happened, and that was, if I had to point to one thing that I think was significant in the change, that would be it. Boy, when I started running in 1970, the Republicans were persona non grata with the AFL-CIO. And so they told me to begin with, these guys, the other Republican candidates said, well, you can win Flathead County.
Yeah.
Lots of us have done it, but the Democrats can beat you here too. And kind of a rite of passage for a Republican is go to the aluminum plant when the shift changes.
Oh, yeah.
And there, as those guys come off work and come out of the gate, then you stand there and introduce yourself and give them your literature. And it's not easy.
No.
Sometimes they'll be pretty tough on you. They'll spit on your literature and cuss you out and that sort of thing. But it's one of the things we kind of figure we need to do. And I think they were kind of enjoying the fact that I was going to have to do that. I don't know how many of them actually did.
So Bob, like, so, I mean, you were a Republican your entire political career. Did you see that your margins of victory increased as they did? Okay. Wow. Interesting.
Yeah, somewhat. But just by inclemency that happened,
Sure.
And then as a school teacher, I attracted some Democrat votes that ordinarily wouldn't have gone to me, would have gone to a Republican. And, so and then I worked hard at it. I tried to be a really a good, knowledgeable legislator who did his homework, and I checked in with people at home, frequently during legislative sessions, the head of the Chamber of Commerce and a member of the City Council, and somebody that would have some interest in something and know something about something that could help me. But I was going to tell you, I tried to do that too in regard to the change of shifts at the aluminum plant. Because remember, I'd been student body president at Montana State University just before I ran for the legislature the first time.
Yeah.
In fact, I ran in the primary election when I was still a senior in college. And so anyway, I knew Miss Wool, I knew Miss Rodeo Montana, I knew the Crescent girls from my fraternity house. I don't remember, but I got 4 or 5 of the best looking girls at Montana State University to come up here, and they took these white matchbooks that used to be popular to give away at weddings and that sort of thing. Now, of course, that wouldn't be politically correct, but they took felt tip markers and wrote in their
none of this story right now would be politically correct. Not just the matchbooks, the rest of it.
Well, I didn't hardly realize that, but anyway, they wrote in their feminine handwriting to please vote for Bob Brown. And then I had them stand at the gate. I wasn't even on the crime scene. I was back in my car in the parking lot. And these guys would come out and they'd eagerly accept the matchbook and they'd call their attention to Bob Brown. We hope you vote for him for the state legislature or state representative or whatever. And those rascals, as much as they despised Republicans, would go right back around in the gate and come back out through the out gate again to have another chance to get a matchbook from these pretty girls. So anyway, at the end of the election, you'll be, I guess, maybe a little surprised to know, I thought this was brilliant. But anyway, of the 10 candidates that were running, guess where I placed in Columbia Falls?
Well, I'm guessing I'm going to have to say first or second there then, Bob.
10th.
10th?
Dead last.
Didn't work.
Well, the big unionized sawmill was over in Columbia Falls. The aluminum plant was in Columbia Falls. So that was the hardest nut to crack for a Republican then at that time was Columbia Falls.
So whoever says sex sells is just wrong.
Yeah, I think so. In my case, it was. And I guess I didn't think about it that crassly, but I changed my luck over there rather than just stand and get abused, the gate by myself and probably not help myself a bit. I thought that might be a creative way of, of helping myself. So anyway, I had myself. I'd go to the Big Fork football game and the Kalispell football games and the Columbia Falls and Whitefish and so on. I went to at least one of each one of those local football teams that fall, and I'd have myself paged. So I'd be sitting somewhere up in the back of the stands at Big Fork, and the guy would come on the system. That used to be more common than it is now. And he said, "Would Bob Brown please come to the," but Bob Brown, then I'd walk all the way down, and everybody in the Big Fork community that was going to the football game would see me do that.
Yeah.
And so that was another angle I used. And still remember, I only came 5th out of 10.
Yeah.
But I didn't know anybody. I didn't have any, I hadn't made any connections in my life. I hadn't,
Right.
truthfully, probably earned the right to be a state legislator. So I had to think of every strategy that I could that I thought might help me. But I tried to work especially hard at it and be especially committed and dedicated as I could after I got on, because for one thing, I loved it. I had some aptitude for doing it, and I felt an obligation to be the best representative I could for the people that elected me as I possibly could be.
Oh, exactly.
And, yeah. And I, to mention just one other thing, and this sounds kind of self-serving, but it's true. I thought of people in my community who I greatly respected, and they were always watching me. There was a little committee of them. There were 5 or 6 of them, 4 or 7 or something like that. But I did this every session I was in the legislature, even when I was an older guy and in leadership. And I always thought, while I was thinking about the vote and before I actually cast the vote, either in the committee or on the floor, these guys are watching. Would you be able to explain to them why you did this? And if I couldn't, I didn't vote that way. And so that's part of why I think my voting record in all the years I was in the legislature, maybe some people found kind of hard to understand, but I just felt, that I wanted to feel as though the people I was elected to represent were looking over my shoulder all the time, and I had to keep faith with them. And
I think that's an attitude that more politicians should share. That you're not there yourself. You're there representing your entire electorate who can't go there with you.
That's right.
Yeah,
that was
exactly.
my
right.
Yeah.
They cast their faith in you to argue on their behalf. So if you can't then justify what you're doing, then what are you doing there?
That's right.
Right.
That's exactly right. That's how I saw it. That's how I felt about it.
Yeah.
And I've tried to be that way, as I guess I've mentioned, all the way through. One of the issues that was big at that time was that the 1972 Constitution had basically made it legal to have gambling in Montana. And prior to 1972, legalized gambling was unconstitutional. So the legislature couldn't even deal with the issue. But after 72, beginning in the 1973 legislative session, we could. Well, I had a kind of a blue-nosed attitude, I suppose, about that. I didn't ever like it very well. And so I opposed it. And so the legislature came to a compromise in the 1973 session that they would legalize a lottery, that they'd legalize poker with a limited pot limit, like, I don't know what it was, $30 or something. And they legalize bingo, lotteries, and limited pot poker. And the idea was, well, go ahead and give the people what they think they're demanding and what they think they want, but we won't really go overboard. Well, wouldn't you know, what happened was a lottery, the state lottery passed, but bingo, the bingo card that they play at the old folks' home or the basement of the Lutheran church or something like that, they decided that by the rules of bingo, it was close enough related to Keno, which was a casino game,
right,
that the bingo law made Keno legal. Well, that changed things. And then they decided, well, in Las Vegas, they no longer hardly even play any Keno anymore. They play Keno on Keno machines.
Right.
And if Keno's legal, then what difference does it make how you play it? So Keno machines popped up all over the state. And there was a law about that time there was a Supreme Court case got the Supreme Court about that time called the Treasure State Games case. And the Treasure State Company owned a lot of these gambling machines. And so there was a suit brought against them, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the company that had the Keno machines, which were basically slot machines.
Yeah, right.
Then what was supposed to happen? Remember I told you the limited pot poker was legal?
Yes.
Well, then what they did is they said, gosh, they got poker machines down in Las Vegas. Well, if Keno is legal, because bingo was legal and the machines were therefore legal, then why the heck can't we have poker machines? And that's where all that led. It didn't really even come through the legislature. It came through court cases.
Yeah.
But anyway, I lost that battle. And, I remember thinking at the time, it's really not a fair fight because they had I don't remember, but they had the machine owners, the tavern keepers where the machines were located. They had the League of Cities and Towns because they got all the money from the gambling machines, and a heck of a lot more money would be generated from the machines than if there weren't the machines. And I had the Montana Council of Churches on my side. That was it. That would come in and openly, advocate for me. So you can see what kind of a fight that was.
Yeah.
But
on one side you had Bob Brown and maybe God, if that is your way of faith, and on the other side you had all the money in the world.
But they also had a strong legal team. They knew what they were doing when they went before the Supreme Court too. And so anyway, where we are today with casinos and that sort of thing, which we've all just accepted as a part of our culture, me included, it hasn't harmed anything, particularly horribly that I know of. It's just a fact of life. And so, but that was something I had a major involvement in when I was running in the first couple of elections, I think maybe in 1988, 1992 or something. I had opponents strongly backed and financed by the tavern industry and the casino industry and so on from all over the state. So I had pretty tough opposition because of that, but I'm not sorry I did it, but anyway, that's how our system works. The coal tax was a big thing going on then. Montana discovered the Fort Union coal deposit, or we knew it was there. But when the Arab oil embargo made us starving for energy, and there were long lines in front of gas stations and so on all over the country. That occurred in the late 70s, I think. And so anyway, we were trying to develop our own sources of energy in the United States to become energy independent.
Right.
And we had a huge deposit of coal in eastern Montana. So right away, companies moved in to take advantage of that because there was a big market for coal, not just in the United States either, but also again in Japan. And the environmentalists who were just kind of emerging in the 1970s were horrified by the prospect of that. And there were some scenarios that really made it sound like if we put pedal to the metal to develop that big Fort Union coal deposit, it had just transformed Montana. It'd just make it a totally different state. Well, some people liked the idea of that development and the money it would generate, but other people felt it would be a catastrophic development. Anyway,
Bob, it sounds like you're reading the paper like yesterday. Sounds like you're reading headlines yesterday.
Some of this is pretty old memories, and I couldn't tell you the legislative session. I couldn't say now in 75 or 79 or 70 whatever. I don't remember that, but I generally remember the issues. And Montana had generated a lot of money in the 1970s. We had budget surpluses. Well, in the 80s, we didn't. That's when you had the decline in timber harvest. That's when the mines closed down in Butte, that sort of thing. And the governor at the time was what we called a snug Democrat. That was Ted Schwinden. He was a Democrat, and he was a partisan Democrat, but he wasn't a liberal Democrat. Ted was really snug with a buck. He was a very conservative Democrat when it came to fiscal responsibility.
Sure.
Some people said that, not necessarily about the same issues, but Harry Truman was a partisan Democrat. The only way he liked Republicans was fried. But he shared their philosophy on a few things.
Yeah.
And that was the same thing with Schwinden. So Schwinden didn't believe in deficit spending. And so he had to be a real careful money manager. And what worried him was our 30% tax on coal, which was very high, highest in the nation by far. Montana had a 30% tax on coal. And that's because the environmentalists didn't want to see it developed. So they thought if we put a high enough tax on it, it won't develop. And they were right.
Yeah.
Because the coal developed in Wyoming was being developed a lot faster. And they actually raised their tax to what would amount to about 15%. And this is, I don't take you into the morbid details of it, but it was the price of a ton of coal at the mouth of the strip mine was the 30% or 15%. And the Wyoming tax was structured differently, but it amounted to about half of ours.
Yeah. Right.
So they were getting all the new mines and all the business. So Schwinden proposed to the legislature that we whack our 30% coal tax in two. We lower it down so it'd be competitive for Wyoming at about 15%.
Mm-hmm.
And that passed. And that did result in some more coal development in Montana. And that did help our revenue situation a little bit. But those were tough times. And that was both the 30% tax and the 15% tax were hotly controversial issues. And I didn't really have a dog in the fight because from Flathead County, we don't have an ounce of coal, or at least ever commercial. I guess there's some traces of it up in the North Fork and so on, but we were never a coal development area. So I could go with the environment or the coal development. And I had sentiments on both sides. I mean, I could understand both sides. But anyway, land use regulations were a big deal. A lot of development was going on in the Flathead County and Flathead Valley. That stuff wasn't going on over where they were mining the coal. There weren't very many people who lived over there, but a lot of people then, even then, it seems like 50 years ago or 40 or 50 years ago, but people were discovering the Flathead Valley and moving in then.
Man, things aren't changing any, are they, Bob?
No, that's right. So us, I had close friends in the legislature from Valley County down around Hamilton and Stevensville because they had the same interests I had. They had timber, they had agriculture, they had beautiful scenery. And so we got together on a lot of things. And the same way with rural Bozeman, the Gallatin Valley and that sort of thing. Again, they were having people move in, hordes of people and take over their valley. So one of the things we did, we voted, say again?
And still are.
Yeah, they still are.
Same thing's happening down there.
Even going faster now than they were.
Exactly.
But anyway, one of the things I voted for that was dumb was we thought, well, we want to prevent the farmland from being all gobbled up by these subdivisions. So one of the provisions in one of the development regulation laws provided that you could only pay property taxes on what would amount to agricultural land if you had at least 20 acres. So if you were a farmer who had some land in a good location, say you had a couple of 100 acres of land, rather than divide it up into single acre lots and have a couple of 100 people or more than that move into that relatively small acreage, we could tell that guy, well, look, with almost no complications, you don't have to say mother may I to anybody, you can sell that land in 20-acre parcels. And then our idea was we don't have this concentration of people coming in and changing the landscape and ruining for agriculture, because they'll be able to either be small farmers themselves, or they'll be able to lease their land to somebody who can grow hay on it or grain on it or whatever, 20 acres at a time. And it'll be the best idea, but it wasn't. It just meant that we had little 20-acre parcels that were all grown up in weeds and and it was never used. It was never really farmed or anything like that. But the people got a tax break instead of having to pay taxes on residential property.
Right.
They had 20 acres of agricultural property.
Yeah.
So they got a tax break for actually using up more good farmland than would otherwise have been the case. But anyway, that was one of the big things that impacted Flathead County during that period of time. And I thought I was doing the Lord's work, but it turns out, I think in retrospect, I wasn't. So then the Lakeshore Protection Act. Do you remember the conflict about the bridge to nowhere down on the north shore of Flathead Lake?
That's still pretty current events, because that's been in the paper pretty recently.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I had the Lakeshore Protection Act. That was my bill that I sponsored in the legislature to protect some developments that we were concerned about then on Whitefish Lake, but it applied to the lakes, Flathead Lake as well.
Right.
And that was just used, as you mentioned, that was just used to make them tear down that bridge to go to the island. That was the statute that I passed that made that happen. And this kind of gets into the area of bragging a little bit, maybe, but
You're allowed to brag a little bit, bro. You can brag a little bit.
okay, well, there was a bill that I introduced that was called the Fish and Wildlife Mitigation Fund. And people may think, what in the heck is that? Well, on the federal level, they decided that states, and this came, the request of states from around the country, should be compensated for the land that's flooded by federal dam projects and other federal projects. Well, Hungry Horse Dam and Lake Koocanusa, those two dams had huge reservoirs. And so a calculation was done on how much Montana was owed to indemnify it for those two big reservoirs that were built by the federal government and major portions of this state. And I don't remember what the amount was. But anyway, I introduced a bill to make sure it all got into a trust fund. It got into the same trust fund, and then it could be used for things like mitigating for, fish and wildlife losses, which were incalculable. But, to me, that was the idea of the whole thing. And that was a little bit controversial because, politicians could see an opportunity to get some money, and they could only maybe just vaguely have it related to what I thought it was given to the state to be used for. And one of the things that it was used for was the construction of the Murphy Lake Fish Hatchery up in Lincoln County. And that's still a going concern. Yeah. So a whole lot of cutthroat trout have been raised from minnows and planted in the lakes all over northwestern Montana, and that money came out of the mitigation trust fund.
Yeah,
I have a good feeling about that. And the Les Mason Park, the public park up on Whitefish Lake.
Oh yeah,
that was my goal, to create that. And the local option sales tax, the tourist tax, so-called in Whitefish, didn't have my name on it. And that was done by design, but I was the guy that, was behind it and got it passed.
Yeah.
And the same thing with Lone Pine State Park. My name wasn't on that one either, but I was the guy that was in the key position to get us the money to do that. So,
nice.
As I look back, I can see some things, that I think were valid accomplishments, but I spent 26 years in the House and Senate in Montana, so it was quite a while. And I ended up as president of the Senate, so that was kind of neat. So.
Oh, nice. Yeah, absolutely. That's one heck of a career there, Bob.
Yeah, well, it was fun, every minute of it. I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed bringing people together. And I was a believer in the idea that you can't function, you can't do anything if you don't have a majority. And sometimes then Montana was competitive, as you know, going back in 1970 and since then in the legislature. The Democrats still had majorities in the legislature as recently as the early 90s, I think 2005, maybe 2007. So periodically, the Republicans more often the Democrats had the majority, although not in the time that I served there. I went back and looked at that once, and I think the Democrats had the majority in the chamber in which I served more often than the Republicans did. So that meant I almost always had to get some help from Democrats to get anything passed.
Right.
And so that was how I learned to make politics work. Yeah. That the only way you can get something passed is by partisan muscle, then you could lose it too. I mean, in a session or two later, people would still be mad about it and they'd repeal it.
Yeah, so, that's really not that's not politics working. That's one particular side working, but there's no actual, there's no compromise or deal making or, hey, let's try to win this for everybody involved in that,
Well, that used to be a fine art. That used to be something that people prided themselves at. They would have lawyers in both political parties. They especially excelled in that type of thing, in working out arrangements and well, could you live with the legislation if we repeal this section? Because we need 2 more votes to get it passed because so-and-so is really against it, and he's trying to, and so those things would happen. And to me, that's politics. That's how if people can negotiate with each other and work with each other, that's what prevents fist fights, and that's what prevents gun duels, and that's what prevents wars. Violence is what happens when politics doesn't work.
Yes.
And I think we've got too much power politics going on in the country now.
Power politics is that's a good term for it. Power politics, because it seems like what you were describing is no longer maybe necessary or practiced. But I'm not gonna get bogged down into modern politics. That's definitely not where I want to go. But um,
Me
so
neither.
yeah, so no, so kind of speaking of that, I guess just a couple quick questions before we wrap this up. Like, how and when did you know that, hey, this is, this was fun, and I served, my constituents well. I think it's time to probably take a step back.
I think you just kind of know. You just kind of have a sense of when it's time to come and when it's time to go. I've been there for 26 years. I was president of the Senate, and I just thought, well, now we've got term limitations.
Yes.
They were passed by the people in 1992.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got 3 really good friends that I know want to be president of the Senate. So if I run again, people are going to think, well, Bob, I suppose you're going to want to be reelected. And I'd have to say, no, I think I'm going to support Gary. Well, then there'd be a little bit of wondering about that. So then Gary's down at the president of the Senate's office, and some guys come in to me and say, Bob, do you realize what Gary's doing? Would you have done something like that? And I just thought, look,
right,
for the betterment of Gary and Bruce and Tom, which were these 3 close friends that I know wanted to be president of the Senate, I've had the experience.
Yeah.
And I don't have a passion for it like I used to have. I'm not sure what I'm trying to do. I was a close political friend and a political ally of Mark Roscoe, who was the governor at the time. And I enjoyed that relationship. But I've had that relationship, I didn't need to try to prolong that part of my life forever. So with some reluctance, I didn't run again.
Yeah.
And my friend Gary replaced me, and that was good.
Yeah, absolutely. So, about your kind of personal history as well, and you just kind of brought that up, that you did accomplish that, and you saw that I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, and obviously all that took quite a bit of time. You were a legislator for 26 years, and then the Secretary of State, correct?
Yep,
so
that's right.
So how did you balance all that with your teaching career and with your family and friend obligations? And I'm not just talking about, the blocking out, 4 hours for a drive to Helena, but I'm talking more about emotionally and, mentally.
Well, it was possible then, and I think it still is, for a teacher to be in the legislature.
Yeah.
And there were several of us who were over the years. So it just meant that I was a teacher at the Big Fork High School, the Kalispell High School, and the Whitefish High School over the course of those years. And so the school district, if they looked at it pragmatically, could think, well, we have to pay a substitute less than we have to pay a full-time teacher. So if Bob goes over to Helena for 3 months this winter during the school year, we can hire somebody and pay them, overall a couple of thousand less than we'd have to pay Bob if he was here.
Right.
And that's rather than think, well, that really disrupts the school year and it's bad for the kids and that sort of thing, which I don't think it particularly was, but anyway, that's how it worked. And I was able to do both at the same time. So just think about that's a good life, You love politics, and you have an opportunity to participate in the political system, the 2 parties, the 2 houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives, the governor's the equivalent of the president. So I could have essentially the same experience I could have had back in Washington, D.C., but when I'm tired and sick of it, and I've been double-crossed a couple of times, and I'm kind of mad about it, and I want to go home, I can.
Exactly.
And I go back to kids. And working with kids is a good life.
Yeah.
And so every other year I worked with kids all year, because Montana's legislature only meets every other year. And then in a legislative year, I could, take about this, it was exhilarating and fun and exciting and rewarding all the time I was there. And then when it started to get to become a hard job and that sort of thing, that's when I could go home again.
Yeah.
And so it's a great life. It was a great life for me. And I taught history and government, the things I enjoy and believe in, and tried to bring up the kids that I taught to have the same respect for our system and, to be registered voters and conscientious citizens. And you don't know how much of that you succeed in, but exactly. I tried to, and I had a good spirit for it. So I think I probably succeeded to some extent with it.
Yeah, well, I'm quite a bit younger than you, I believe, just, kind of looking at us here in the side by side. But, I hope that, I hope that my teachers, feel that way about my generation as well. And so, I think that we always have that where we want to, kind of put what we learned into practice. And that always, of course, comes from our teachers and our parents. And, God help us, sometimes our politicians. But yeah.
Well, that's a healthy way of looking at it, I think. Yeah, it is. You bet.
So, Bob, I just really want to say thank you for coming on today and talking with me. And I can't tell you how much I admire what you've done over your years, not only representing, the people here in Northwest Montana and being an educator and everything like that, but your work with history around the state, both with the Historical Society and here, of course, at our humble little museum in Kalispell. And something that you said as we were talking, that as you go to work, you try to think that right next to you were people in your community that you respected and that you were working for them too. And so I try to do that here at the museum, the Northwest Montana History Museum, of course, as well. And you are definitely one of those people that I picture, that we're here working together, and hopefully that, we can get everybody moving in the same direction, and we're not messing things up too much here. And, we're always striving to do better and reach new people and keep history alive. So thanks a lot, Bob, for everything you've done and for joining me today and for joining everybody else out here watching this. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. We have 3 more John White Speaker Series lectures that I invite you to take a look at. And until next time, I will see you later. Thanks a lot again.
Thank you, Jacob.